One of the things that's required for NSX deployment is a distributed switch. And unfortunately, a lot of folks don't get the chance to deploy them. And if you haven't had a chance to study distributed switches recently, there might just be a big question mark in your brain where a distributed switch should go. So in this nugget, we're going to take the time to review the vSphere distributed switch. All right, my friend, we are here inside the vSphere web client. And as you can see, we've got 1, 2, 3 clusters, and in those clusters we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different ESXi hosts that are providing virtualization services. Now, in focusing on the idea of switching, it is not unlikely that you are currently using standard switches. And that means that whenever you need to configure networking, you do that as an operation locally on each one of these ESXi hosts. So for example, I could select ESXi 1, we could go to the Configure tab, then head over to Networking, and take a look at virtual switches. So when we come here and we create additional host networking, we can come in here and create a switch. We can define the uplink ports. We can define virtual machine port groups to allow for access to that switch, and then we can define VM kernel port groups and adapters, which are going to allow for ESXi services to work their way out to the top of rack switches, the physical switches that are on the network. But that operation, as we said, has to be done on each and every one of these ESXi devices. So enter the distributed switch. The distributed switch has to be created on the networking tab of the navigator. And the beauty of that distributed virtual switch is that we can create this here in the vCenter server and then define all of its properties, like how many uplinks will there be and which adapters should be used for those uplinks. Define the port groups that are going to be used for virtual machines and the VLANs that will be associated with those. Name them, keep it consistent, and then deploy that distributed virtual switch to all of our ESXi devices. If we need to make changes down the road, that happens centrally, and then those changes are received and utilized by all those devices. It's distributed. And additionally, there are features that can only be found when using a distributed virtual switch. Things like NetFlow and mirroring and additional governance properties that we can use. And in the context of this class, NSX. If you don't have a distributed switch, you cannot use NSX. Or to be more explicit, the VXLAN encapsulation and de-encapsulation that NSX is based on can only be performed by a distributed virtual switch. So let's just quickly review the process of creating a distributed switch. We'll right-click on region A1, go down to distributed switch, create a new distributed switch. We'll give it a name like test D switch. We'll use the current compatibility of 6.5 or later. Now, an important question is how many uplinks or VM NICs will be associated with this particular distributed switch. So I'm going to up this to 8. We want to make sure that we're using all the bandwidth that we have available to us. We'll leave Network I/O enabled. That's great to have some threshold capability, and we'll let it create a default port group so we have a place to associate VMs. Then we'll click Next, and then Finish. Now that this has been created, we can see we have the switch itself with all of its properties and some of those advanced services and features that are available. We have our definition for the uplink itself, and again, additional uplink specific properties we can configure, and the default port group. And it may be necessary to configure things like the default VLAN of that port group, and we can edit that. If I go over to the VLAN tab, we can associate this with a particular VLAN number if necessary for those virtual machines that are residing on this particular port group. Now, once we've got our distributed switch created, we need to deploy it out to the host. So we can right-click on the switch itself and add and manage hosts. We'll go ahead and choose Add Hosts. And we'll click the green plus to add some new hosts. Notice this is not done on a cluster level, but on an individual host level. If all the nodes should have access to this, we certainly can. Even though these are in different clusters, that does not prevent them from having access to the distributed switch. We'll click OK. Once we click Next. Now, if our hosts are essentially identical, one of the things we can do to speed this up is configure identical networking settings. Use the template mode down at the bottom. That will speed things up so we don't have to configure things that are obviously the same on every host because we deployed them using the exact same configuration. We'll use that in this case and click Next. Which one will be our template host? We'll start with ESXi 01A. So we can manage the physical adapters, the VM kernel adapters, and then optionally we can migrate virtual machine networking, which we'll skip for now. We'll click Next. So here we get the chance to actually assign some interfaces to this switch. So here's the list of all of the interfaces on ESXi01A, my template. I can select VMNIC 0 or VMNIC 1. We'll select 0. Then we'll click Assign Uplink, and I'm going to assign that to fill in the slot for uplink 1, and then click OK. Now, once this is complete, VMNIC 0 will be reassociated from the old switch over to the new switch, whether that's standard to distributed or distributed to distributed, same basic idea. It's putting it where we need it. We can do the same thing with VMNIC 1, assign uplink, associate with uplink 2, OK, there we go. So repurposing those configurations. And because we chose template mode, the same reassignment is going to happen down here. So we can choose apply to all down here at the bottom, and now we are reassigning all of these devices to use that same common configuration. Please make sure that actually makes sense before you go making changes in that template mode. Then we'll click Next. So now we get to the point of assigning VM kernel network adapter functionality. This is very important. In some cases, you may choose not to reassociate VM kernels with the distributed port group. It's not necessary in order to perform this action. In other words, storage access, management access, vMotion access, none of that needs to necessarily be pulled off of the standard switch if you still have a standard switch that still has a VMNIC available as an uplink. But if all of our adapters are now going through the distributed switch, well, then we'll need to have our VM kernels go through that distributed switch as well so that we can do all the standard management options. So that'll mean selecting a VM kernel adapter and then assigning it a port group on that distributed switch. So we go to Assign Port Group, and here it is. Now, Test Default Port Group. When I described that earlier, what did I say that was for? That was for the VMs. That was just a standard VM port group. Now, this is a good time to bring up a key difference between the standard switch and the distributed switch. With a standard switch, we create port groups for virtual machines and then VM kernel adapters with VM kernel ports as a separate operation. Technically, there is a port group that is created and an adapter that is created to support that kernel association, but it all gets created as a single step. With a distributed switch, we create port groups, and then once that port group is created, we could choose to assign virtual machines to that or VM kernel adapters to that. This portion is done actually still in the ESXi host level network configuration, whereas the creation of port groups, defining their VLANs, all of that is done in the distributed switch configuration. So I said that to say this: when we look at this configuration that's available to me right now, I only have one port group. Is that set up with the right configuration, the right VLAN for management or storage or vMotion? No, I haven't gone through that configuration yet, which really means that we are not ready to actually deploy this. Because as soon as I deploy it, it warns me that I might temporarily lose network connectivity. But in reality, my friend, I'm going to lose all network connectivity because management and connectivity between the ESXi host and the vCenter server is done through a VM kernel adapter. So that means really at this point, I need to cancel out of this and then go through that process of getting our equivalent VLAN and network configuration, port group configuration set up in the distributed switch. So let me show you what that looks like. If I expand out the Region 1 Compute Cluster distributed switch, we'll select the switch. Then up here at the top, we'll click Networks. We can see the distributed port groups versus the uplink port groups. And we can see here, here's a specific port group for vMotion support. And while in this case it's not using a particular VLAN, this is where we would configure that to use, VLAN 110 or whatever the vMotion VLAN might be. Here's one for storage to get to iSCSI. Here's the default management port group that is just a port group. It doesn't look any different. There's nothing that indicates here that it's going to be used for the purpose of a VM kernel. You can't tell just by looking at it here. It's all in how we use it. Now down the road, once we have configured NSX, we're going to see all sorts of exciting port groups created that are logical switches that are going to be associated with VXLAN network identifiers. Let me mention one other last-minute note here. If you haven't been using distributed switches, it's probably because you've been using the vSphere standard license. Distributed switches were available with Enterprise Plus licensing. But just as an FYI, you can support distributed switches once you add NSX support even to a standard license of vSphere. So you don't have to upgrade your vSphere licenses in order to add the NSX services. I thank you for revisiting the core concepts of distributed switches with me. It is absolutely critical that as you look at your own network environment, you verify that you're using distributed switches, and if not, that you start looking at this process of transitioning from standard switches to distributed switches before you deploy NSX. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.